History as it happens, January 6, 2022. The Capitol riot 1 year later.
We have an obligation, I believe, to protect the integrity of the election.
Let's have trial by combat.
All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen by emboldened radical left Democrats, which is what they're doing.
Multiple capital entries. Multiple capital entries.
Now we gather due to a selfish man's injured pride and the outrage of supporters who he has deliberately misinformed for the past 2 months and stirred to action this very morning.
The demonstrators who infiltrated the Capitol have defiled the seat of American democracy.
There's no question, none, that President Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of the day.
It's been 1 year since Donald Trump egged on a mob to attack Congress, the violent culmination of his months-long effort to overturn the election. 1 year later, the wound still festers. Americans remain divided, living in realities of their own creation. Reconciliation seems out of reach. 1860 redux. But instead of civil war, we're witnessing a virtual secession from one another. That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
The president needs to tell people in the Capitol to go home. This is hurting all of us. He is destroying his legacy, Laura Ingraham wrote.
The Justice Department remains committed to holding all January 6 perpetrators at any level accountable under law, whether they were present that day or were otherwise criminally responsible for the assault on our democracy.
On the morning of January 6, 2021, it was my third day on the job, and I was going to spend the day preparing to launch this podcast later that month. I was on my way to work listening to Donald Trump's speech at the Stop the Steal rally, and I remember catching this part.
Now it is up to Congress to confront this egregious assault on our democracy. And after this, we're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down. We're going to walk down anyone you want, but I think right here we're going to walk down to the Capitol.
And I remember my reaction. I laughed. Of course he wasn't going to march down Pennsylvania Avenue with his supporters. But what I did not anticipate happening that day soon unfolded on TV screens all over the world. And all of us, President Trump included, spent hours watching.
Effectively a riot.
So here we are a year later. More than 700 people have been arrested. Federal authorities estimate as many as 2,500 rioters could face charges. But it remains unclear if the Justice Department will pursue Trump himself or any of the rally's organizers. Would doing so heal our wounds?
My personal opinion is that despite the potential problems of exposing the violence and making sure everybody knows exactly what happened, despite the potential problems of that, that's what they have to do.
Paul Quigley runs the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies at Virginia Tech. Our conversation is coming up in a moment, as we once again seek wisdom or clarity by returning to the time of disunion when the nation split over slavery. There is no single issue dividing Americans today the way slavery tore apart North and South. Whatever is dividing us, different sets of values, interpretations of the past, fears of cultural or demographic change, rank partisanship, whatever it is, those divisions are reflected in a new CBS News poll that found Americans view the January 6 riot through a partisan or culture war lens. 4 in 10 Republicans say most of those who forced their way into the Capitol were left-leaning groups pretending to be Trump supporters. And 56% of Republicans say the rioters were defending freedom. 47% say it was patriotism. Whatever your position, whether you think Donald Trump belongs in the White House or belongs in prison, I want you to think of something as you listen to our conversation, and that is, how long can this go on? What will it take to find some common ground? It is not in the nation's interest to have the investigations by the Justice Department and the Select Committee in the House drag on. It is also not in the nation's interest to move on before the truth is known. But then what? Trials, long prison sentences, ostracize the wrongdoers, or invite them back into the body politic? Paul Quigley is a historian at Virginia Tech, and he is working on a book about Preston Brooks, the Southern congressman who caned Senator Charles Sumner in 1856, an act that led to, yes, an investigation by a House committee made up of 2 pro-slavery Southern Democrats and 3 Northern Republicans, a new party at the time. And the committee's work, in the words of our guest, revealed the necessity of exposing political violence. Paul Quigley, welcome back.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
Our loyal listeners know that you were my very first guest on episode number 1, after the January 6th riot and prior to Joseph Biden's inauguration 1 year ago already. It's hard to believe a year has gone by.
Yeah, definitely. Very quick.
Yes, and you've been on a couple of times. Our most recent conversation, we discussed the 1850s, comparing the divisions and the controversies of that decade to our present moment. And you recently wrote a piece in the Washington Post in which you said of the January 6th committee, which is still investigating the attack on the Capitol 1 year ago, you said it is vital to establish the truth, both the facts of what happened and their broader meaning for U.S. politics. So what is the broader meaning for U.S. politics today?
I think it's a very dangerous time in American politics, and I think the events of January 6th last year made that very clear. But also the aftermath, the reactions to January 6th and the way they've changed and evolved over the last 12 months have reinforced that sense of danger in American politics. The lesson that's beginning to come into view is that if you're brazen enough to keep saying something, it will seem true. Manipulating elections, telling lies about elections is just an extremely effective way in a democratic system to spread uncertainty and chaos and just destabilize the foundations of democracy.
Democracy has vulnerability, or many vulnerabilities.
Yes. With January 6th in particular, the role of violence in destabilizing democracy became evident. And I don't think violence was the only story on January 6th. I think that was just one manifestation of a broader campaign. But the place of violence in politics is something that's under debate at the moment, I think, in the American public. There are divisions over when violence is acceptable, what would have to happen in order for you to justify violence in the political system. And that conversation has changed a lot over the last year and over the last 2 or 3 decades as well.
These questions are not new, but they're nonetheless unsettling that we're discussing it today. My initial question about the broader meaning, I suppose how one answers that may come down to just how seriously each of us believes democracy was and is being threatened by Donald Trump's effort to overturn the election, not just through the January 6th rally that turned into a riot. Some call it a coup, an attempted coup. But part of our problem today is that a good number of people, and it's hard to know exactly how many people we're talking about, percentages or raw numbers, but a good number of people don't believe democracy was truly threatened by what happened on January 6th. They believe that the threat was coming from a rigged or stolen election. So how much trouble is democracy in the United States? Because it's hard to know what it looks like when democracy fails.
It's definitely difficult to predict the future in such a volatile situation as this one. But I think that one of the really troubling things for me is the apparently growing acceptance of violence as a tool in politics. You mentioned that it's difficult to put a precise number on that. There have been some polls, but obviously they're never entirely reliable on touchy subjects like this one. But it seems clear that the impulse to use violence in politics and the acceptance that that's a legitimate form of politics is to some degree growing. One of the really alarming poll results I've seen over the last few days was in a recent poll that found 62% of Americans expect violence over a future election. And the fact that 62% expect it, even though I assume, most of those 62% don't approve of it, don't want it. But the fact that they expect it, I think, is really a troubling sign.
We'll get into more of the findings from that CBS News poll that just came out as we continue to talk about this. What I said before about what does it look like when democracy fails, let me just clarify that a bit. The cliche is tanks in the street, there's a military coup, the kinds of things we see happen in other countries. It's not quite that clear-cut in the United States when we're talking about efforts now underway in states to take over state election boards. In many states, about 36, there have been Republican-written bills to restrict voting. Secretaries of state at the state level who are in charge of their state elections. There are several people running for that office who do not believe the 2000 election was fair. They believe that Donald Trump was robbed. I think that's what we mean, right, when we're talking about the insidious, slow death, so to speak, of democracy in our own country.
I agree. It's much more likely that attacks on democracy in the United States are going to happen at the level of constitutional arguments over which electoral vote counts from certain states are actually legitimate. So it's not the tanks in the street to look out for. It's all of those more subtle, insidious attacks on constitutional democracy.
Because the January 6th riot itself was unable to produce the outcome the rioters might have thought possible. It was a ceremonial certification. Maybe ceremonial is not the exact right word, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
When Congress meets to certify the Electoral College, the election's already been decided. It cannot really be stopped, although some people have floated the idea that it could. Given the growing body of evidence that the January 6th riot was organized, or at least the rally was organized and planned by people like Steve Bannon, how do you describe what happened? Because earlier, in one of our earlier discussions, you called it an insurrection, maybe even a coup d'etat. It looks like those words are not as crazy as I once thought they were.
I agree with the more we find out about the background to January 6th and the efforts by other Trump supporters to push these events along, the more it does seem like a broad-based insurrection or a coup attempt. Because I think if you just looked at the rioters themselves on January 6th, it looked as though it maybe was a protest that sort of clumsily spiraled out of control. But if you look at those events in the context of this broader campaign to delegitimize the election results in the mind of the public, to pressure, everyone from Mike Pence to state legislators, it comes to seem much more like one strand of a coup attempt or an insurrection.
To my earlier point, NPR did an analysis that found 15 people, Republicans, are running for Secretary of State, so that would be 15 different states. These 15 candidates believe the election was stolen or that there was something wrong with the outcome. Let's talk about some of the important differences between, on the one hand, the 1850s and the secession winter of 1860-61, and on the other, today's virtual secession, as Sean Wilentz recently put it, by Donald Trump's most ardent supporters. Here's one weird difference, and this is right in your area of expertise, Paul. Southerners did not say that Lincoln robbed them. No one at the time said that the election was fraudulent. No one claimed that Preston Brooks actually did not attack Charles Sumner. It's not that they were totally moored to reality, the Southern fire eaters, once 1860 came along. But today, 4 in 10 Republicans, according to a CBS News poll, say most of those who forced their way into the Capitol were left-leaning groups pretending to be Trump supporters. And I think part of our problem today is we can't even agree on the facts of what happened on January 6th.
I think this is a really interesting comparison to make. You're absolutely right that there was much less disagreement about the basic facts of what happened in the 1850s and then in the election of 1860. Nobody really came out and said Lincoln didn't win, he's an illegitimate president. But what I would also say is that surrounding the debates over slavery and the extension of slavery in the 1850s in the lead up to the American Civil War, you did see conspiracy theories, again, not about the basic facts, but more about the broader motivations and the sort of longer term motivations of people on the opposing side. There's a great book and line of argument by one of the great historians of the 20th century, Richard Hofstadter. He came up with this theory of what he called the paranoid style in American politics, ranging from the pre-Civil War period to the 1950s with John Birch societies, anti-communism, that kind of thing. But it does apply, I think, to the 1850s in that people on both sides believed their foes on the other side were out to get them, basically. So on the side of pro-slavery Southerners, they looked at white Northerners and saw incipient abolitionists who were out to end slavery, out to destroy the livelihood of slaveholders in the South. On the other side, white Northerners increasingly came to see Southerners as a threat to American democracy. They talked about this vision, this image, this idea of the slave power, which depicted a kind of conspiracy among slaveholding Southern politicians, leaders, to take over American politics and to steer it in the direction of pro-slavery policies.
There was some truth to that, though.
Absolutely, yeah. The thing about both of those ideas is that there was a lot of truth. People did blow the threat up for sure. And that's why Hofstadter felt able to fit this time period into his paranoid style thesis. But there was certainly a strong basis on both sides.
According to that same poll, 56% of Republicans say the rioters were defending freedom. 47% say it was patriotism. Preston Brooks was seen as a martyr who was simply defending his honor, right, when he attacked Charles Sumner. So no one denied that he actually hit Charles Sumner over the head with his cane, but the way it was framed and the narratives that took on a life of their own afterward, I think there are some important parallels between the two eras, right?
Absolutely. I think in both cases, the question that people are asking and answering is, was this act of violence justified? And that almost always happens with any act of violence is there's a debate over its legitimacy. The person inflicting the violence presumably thinks it was legitimate, but the audience and spectators and observers often disagree. And that was true back then. It's definitely been true over the last year.
Well, I guess I was foolish to think American citizens would come together after what happened on January 6th. That was the final straw. It's bad enough to say the election was stolen, but when your supporters are chanting, "Hang Mike Pence," 150 police officers were injured that day. Several people died. 147 Republicans in the House still voted against certifying the election results. It would seem democracy is in worse shape now than it was a year ago.
I think it's been a difficult year in many respects. And like you, in the immediate aftermath of January 6th, especially seeing some of the Republican leadership clearly chastened by what had happened, clearly not willing to go along with this act of violence. That was encouraging, I think, for all the reasons you just laid out. But obviously what we've seen in the 12 months since then is retraction from that initial response and more acceptance among the Republican leadership and among certain elements of the electorate.
One of the trenchant points you make in your Washington Post essay is, while it's critically important for the House committee, the January 6th Select Committee, to do its job and investigate the facts and get the truth out to the American people, that can have unintended consequences and pull us even further apart. Why don't you discuss that a little bit?
I think the Select Committee is in a very difficult situation because whichever path they take, there are two extremes, I guess, that they could take. One would be to go all in on exposing the violence, condemning the perpetrators, condemning those who supported or facilitated or encouraged the violence, and really just take the opportunity they have to publicize these events and just make sure nobody has any excuse for not knowing the full extent of what happened and who was involved. So that's one path they can take. The other path they could take is to be more conciliatory. They've moved in this direction in a couple of small ways. They could try and make the committee seem more bipartisan, for example, and try to turn it into a vehicle of moderation, of conciliation. Neither side is going to work perfectly. And my personal opinion is that despite the potential problems of exposing the violence and making sure everybody knows exactly what happened, despite the potential problems of that, that's what they have to do. They have to go all in on that. The hearings they're talking about in the spring would be one example of that.
Well, as you say, there are no perfect solutions.
And in the context of such a sharply polarized political system, any effort to hold people on the other side accountable for what they have done is likely to backfire and result in a strengthening rather than a weakening of the other side's core support.
You mentioned before, is it ever justified to use violence to achieve political goals? And fortunately, the CBS News poll found tiny percentages say yes to that question. If there's violence from your side after a future election, would you favor it? Only 3% of Democrats say yes, 2% of Republicans say yes, 82% of Democrats say no, 67% of Republicans say no. And there was a third answer to that question. It depends. So 15% of Democrats, when asked if violence is a legitimate means to achieve political ends, said, well, it depends on what you're talking about. 30% of Republicans said it depends. But these polls are in the abstract. I'm not sure that some of these findings are all that helpful for figuring out what's going on today. What do you think of that?
There's a distinction people make when they're answering those polls between the idea of themselves perpetrating violence and going out into the streets after a disputed election versus, like you say, the more abstract idea of somebody else doing it. The "it depends" category maybe speaks to that distinction, but I wonder what would happen if you asked those individuals, would you be out in the streets fighting and really risking your lives in the aftermath of an election?
Some of the findings fall along partisan lines, and the survey also determined that among those who say violence is acceptable in certain situations, those people were on the margins, far left, far right. But isn't it true today and in say the 1850s, that the margins start to get larger and the middle gets squeezed because of that cycle of charge, countercharge, events take on a momentum of their own?
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to think about the pre-Civil War decades. If you think about the pre-Civil War period, roughly 1830 through 1860, when Americans began to fight over the future of slavery in a more politically visible way, the period began with a very small minority of extremists on both sides who would have been willing to see this as a fight, an existential fight. And what you see happening gradually with incident after incident is, as you put it, the proportion of the extremists grows and grows and grows on both sides, forcing moderates to take a stand. And they do that in a variety of ways. But one of the ways they do it is through spectacular incidents like the caning of Sumner, like John Brown's raid in 1859. Those are the kinds of things that force moderates who previously might not have been on board with the idea this is an existential fight which could justify violence, but they're moving in that direction.
Are there problems with comparing today to the 1860s, 1850s?
Yeah, I think it's always difficult. The thing with comparisons is they're never going to be exact because the context is so very different. In terms of the comparison between the 1850s and today, the really big thing, I think, is that there's no one single issue like slavery, which is driving the country into two opposing camps. And that really structured what happened in the 1850s. So I think you can draw interesting comparisons about the process of polarization, the kind of moves that extremists make, the kind of positions moderates find themselves in and the shifts they make in their thinking. But yeah, when you dig deeper, the power of the comparison begins to lose force.
We're not having a sectional crisis today. It's not North versus South, although we should add that the 4 southern border states that were on the border with the North did not secede. But we're having a sort of virtual secession. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I'm not sure that secession is technically, the right term to use, but I think some kind of virtual breakup of the country is partly underway, I think. There does seem to be a major split in very basic principles in what is actually true.
The CBS poll asked people, should the United States be divided into red and blue countries? I don't know how that would work because they're not all contiguous. But the idea, right? Only 7% strongly favored it, 16% somewhat favor it, 21% somewhat oppose, 56% strongly oppose. I suppose if we can even ask that question, that's an indication that we're in some troubled times, right?
People were not doing these kinds of opinion polls back in the 1850s, but at most points in what we think of today as the run-up to the Civil War, the huge majority of Americans, if asked, would have said, we do not want the country to break up. You know, even back in the 1850s, that would only have been a minority of white Southerners and also an even smaller minority of abolitionists who would have said this is the best solution to our problem is to separate into different countries.
How did the secessionists get public opinion on their side after Lincoln won the election? Was it because their arguments were the most convincing, or was there some intimidation there?
I think it was a combination. On the one hand, it was an information campaign, a kind of propaganda campaign that secessionists ran in depicting Lincoln and the Republican Party as a very serious threat to the livelihood of white Southerners, a threat certainly to the institution of slavery, but they also depicted this threat as being much broader threat to the racial identity, the status of white Southerners that they secured from being white in white supremacist society. So it was partly just a process of persuading the electorate, this is a real danger, we need to take this seriously. But there was also some intimidation. It's obviously difficult to document because people don't tend to leave much trace of this kind of thing. But the people who were leading the charge for secession in the southern states tended to be the powerful people in politics, you know, and I'm not saying that all politicians and leaders were gung-ho for secession. Many of them were not, but the secessionists were able to use political power, social and economic power. They tended to be big people in their community who had a certain level of authority. So there was some gentle intimidation and also probably, again, it's difficult to document, but probably some dodgy practices in at least some of those state votes for secession.
Because the secession had to be ratified. There was some public process there.
In some of the states, not all of them. For example, Virginia, where I live, the process was that the secession convention decided whether the state seceded or not. They initially decided no, but then in the wake of Fort Sumter, in the wake of Lincoln's call for troops in April 1861, the secession convention decided yes, but they had to get that ratified by a state referendum a few weeks later, which also voted in the affirmative. But honestly, by that point, Virginia had already joined the Civil War in every practical sense and was allied with the Confederacy. So it was really too late for the electorate to have a serious say.
And once the bullets start flying, then you can get people on board to defend your so-called nation from a northern invasion. The fire eaters in South Carolina are the ones who got this all started, but there were members of the slaveocracy who wanted to wait, who wanted to see what Lincoln was going to do before they took that leap.
So there was a first wave of the Deep South states, and this was very neatly geographically organized. So it was the lower tier of southern states that seceded in the first wave. And then the rest of the slaveholding states decided to wait and see. Lots of debate within those states about what to do. And then 4 of those states decided to secede after Fort Sumter and Lincoln's call for troops. But then the other border slaveholding states, of course, never seceded at all. They stayed with the Union, even though there was a lot of secessionist sentiment within those states. It was not enough to pull them out.
And the secessionists had a lot of work to do convincing non-slave holders to go along with this. Some of the arguments were like, well, you're not that far away from owning a slave yourself. A few more years of hard work and you'll have enough money to afford one, because most slaveholders own fewer than 5 slaves.
And this ties in quite strongly with what we're talking about with January 6th and violence in politics, because one of the most effective arguments secessionists could make is that your lives, they often put it in terms of your women and families, are under direct threat from this abolitionist crusade. And what they meant by that is things like John Brown's raid, which had intended to foment a slave insurrection, which would have presumably been bad for slave owners, but also for white non-slave owners in the South who could have been victims of black violence.
And they also said, the slave holders, the secessionists said, if there's abolition, it's going to lead to societal degradation. And we wealthy slave masters are going to be able to flee that degradation. But you poor white non-slave holding folks, you're going to get stuck here with all these freed black people.
Yeah, and it was very effective, and it tied into white non-slave holders' image of themselves as independent men in a white supremacist society who had control over the women in their families, had control not only over their children within their households, but also had superiority over the black people around them. So absolutely saying to them that if slavery is abolished, you will be on an equal footing with black people, you'll be in economic competition with them. That was a really scary prospect for them.
So, Paul, I thank you for being so nimble as I bounce back and forth between present and past. We're going to leap back to present time on this point. There was an issue behind all of this. It was slavery, the future of slavery. Today, the issue is what? Donald Trump's personality, the big lie about the stolen election. So it may appear there is no central issue, but at the same time, the people who propagate the big lie about the election are pandering to deep and wide distrust of American institutions, that there was fertile soil for this type of propaganda, if you will.
Yes, definitely. That was a big part of Trump's appeal to begin with. And he has ridden that horse, for the last 5 years or so in claiming to represent people who have been somehow left behind by modern America, by the way governmental institutions have evolved. And of course, just like in the 1850s, race and gender are tied up with this general sentiment of being left behind. There's a general feeling that amongst Trump supporters, I think that sex equality, racial equality is threatening to white male status, and that the government has maybe gone too far in redressing previous imbalances in power and opportunity and rights and status. So all of that, I think, feeds into the ability to campaign on this big lie.
And I'll emphasize that the number of people, Republicans, Democrats, anyone willing to violently storm the Capitol is tiny as a percentage of the population. But the number of people who believe the election was stolen and might be willing to tolerate, overturning the election is much larger. Reconciliation is important. Our country cannot sustain this perpetual division. How do we get to a point of reconciliation when the former president continues to say the election was stolen? How can we reconcile if the January 6th committee comes out with findings that are rejected out of hand by a large number of people? How do we get there? Maybe we won't.
I think it's a really difficult situation because on the one hand, you absolutely have to tell the truth, not sugarcoat this when it's something as serious as the legitimacy of an election. But on the other hand, as you intimated, when you do that, you tend to, in this situation, give the other side more reason to begrudge what you're doing. You tend to give the other side the ability to turn themselves into martyrs. Again, there's this sense of being left behind or under attack by governmental institutions. And that's the danger of being very forthright in telling the truth.
And even more conspiracy theories are coming out now that this is an FBI plot. After the Civil War, how was Jefferson Davis treated? He was arrested May 10th, 1865, captured by the U.S. Army in southern Georgia. He was trying to flee to Texas. He was charged with treason, but what came of that?
So Jefferson Davis was charged with treason, but was never actually tried. He ended up being released a couple of years after the end of the Civil War. This reflected, I think, the same kind of dilemma that U.S. federal government authorities faced in 1865, as we've just described the January 6th Select Committee facing today. You want to hold people accountable. You want to inflict punishment where it's justified and needed. But what you don't want to do is turn the defeated side, like Jefferson Davis, into a martyr and punish them in such a way that it inspires some kind of reaction against government authority.
I brought up Jeff Davis because there is a debate going on right now about whether or not the Justice Department under Merrick Garland should try to bring charges against the organizers of January 6th. Jeff Davis, General Lee, who I also believe was a traitor, major Confederate figures, not just the people who fought in the Confederate Army, privates and corporals and sergeants, but major leaders of the Confederacy, they were pardoned. And that also can have its set of unintended consequences as well if you're too lenient. We've been talking about the dangers of being too harsh, but if you're too lenient, right? What happened there?
The good thing with thinking about and understanding the consequences of all of this at the end of the Civil War is that we have 150 years of evidence to look at. And I think the evidence suggests that on one level, leniency and this kind of conciliatory attitude that Lincoln took first during the war was to say, let's do whatever we can to bring these white Southern rebels back into the Union. We're not going to punish people overly harshly. We want them back. We want them back in our country, and we'll do what we have to make that happen. So the conciliatory approach began with him, continued, to some degree with some differences in President Johnson and the Republicans in Congress. But anyway, the big picture here is that conciliation did facilitate peace in the United States. For the most part, when we talk about peace after the Civil War, it's important not to ignore ongoing violence by the Ku Klux Klan and similar organizations in the South. But for the most part, conciliation resulted in peace. And so in that sense, it succeeded. But then if you think about what the cost of that success, of that conciliation was, it makes you think a little bit harder, I think, because the cost of that conciliation toward white Southerners was it allowed them to formulate and disseminate the lost cause myth about the Confederacy being this noble entity. It allowed them to continue to subjugate Black Americans, moving towards the Jim Crow regime of the 20th century.
That's the key point. That's the key point. They responded to the conciliatory approach of Abe Lincoln and then President Johnson's pardons, I believe, by denying that slavery was the cause of the Civil War.
Yeah, so there's absolutely dangers in both approaches. I think the Civil War shows that for sure.
The press was partisan in those days, right? You had Democratic or Republican newspapers. They didn't try to hide where they stood on the issues, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
My point being that today we also have issues with a partisan press. Every news entity has its approach, but I do feel like there are some news organizations that are more reliable than others. That being said, we do have a partisan press today that continues to push these ideas, these lies about what happened on January 6th. Some Fox News personalities who were texting Donald Trump and his family to try to get him to say something as the riot unfolded that very night went on television and said things that weren't true.
The Capitol was under siege by people who can only be described as antithetical to the MAGA movement. Now, there were likely not all Trump supporters, and there are some reports that Antifa sympathizers may have been sprinkled throughout the crowd.
We also knew that there's always bad actors that will infiltrate large crowds.
Guess what I'm getting at is I find it hard that we're ever going to bridge this chasm, given the partisan nature of information and disinformation. That was a long-winded question. Sorry, Paul, but go ahead.
No, it's a really good question. And one thing you didn't mention is the social media angle. And I think that's obviously a huge difference from the 1850s, is the fact that so many people get information from sources other than the mainstream press. And so that, I think, has definitely allowed misinformation to circulate even more broadly than it otherwise would have done. I don't think that means that the mainstream press is guilt-free in the misinformation and polarization that we're seeing today. But I just think there's an extra element with social media. But, even in the 1850s, I think there was a lot of misinformation circulating, partly because the press was partisan, partly because people, particularly on the Southern slaveholder side of things, consciously tried to limit information from the other side or to present skewed information. For example, many southern states basically censored abolitionist material. So the newspapers certainly weren't going to print it, and postmasters in southern states refused to deliver abolitionist material, books and pamphlets and that kind of thing. Skewed information was a huge problem in the 1850s and really can help us understand how people got to the point of civil war.
Those are great points. The censoring of the mails, not allowing anti-slavery petitions on the floor of Congress. Thank you for bringing those up. Final point here, to those who cannot believe how, for instance, 147 Republicans still voted against certifying the results of the election, even after the riot. For people who are apoplectic about Republicans who did not vote to convict or impeach Donald Trump after the riot. After Preston Brooks beat the living daylights out of Senator Sumner, the House voted to expel him, but they fell short.
Yes, that's right. So they needed a 2/3 vote. They got a majority, but not a 2/3 majority. It wasn't partisan in quite the same sense. It was more regional or sectional because it was almost entirely a straight north-south vote.
And Preston Brooks did not spend any time in prison for basically nearly killing someone, right?
That's right. He was fined. He went through the court process. And as you mentioned earlier, nobody denied what he had done. He certainly accepted that, I did this. He thought it was justified and tried to make that case. But he said that he was perfectly happy to pay the fine because he admitted he had done it.
If there are iPhones with people videotaping what had happened, maybe the outcome would have been different. But who knows? We have plenty of video showing what happened on January 6th. Paul Quigley, your column in the Washington Post, for people who want to read it, History's Lessons for the January 6th Committee. This isn't the first time a House committee investigated political violence in the Capitol. That's the headline and subheadline for anyone who wants to search for that. On upcoming episodes of History as It Happens, we're going to talk about the Iran nuclear negotiations, NATO's survival, the pro- and anti-slavery Constitution, and the 1776 Unites initiative. Those topics and more coming up this month as we report History as It Happens. New episodes every Tuesday and Thursday. A podcast from the Washington Times.